lecture in this series for the Better Healthcare Technology Foundation on ethical considerations for artificial intelligence in radiology and radiation oncology. My name is Martin Ebert. I'm a researcher at the University of Western Australia and Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital in Perth. So today we're talking about ethics in AI in medicine, and this is becoming quite an important topic as AI-equipped technologies are becoming widespread in healthcare, and this foundation represents medical physicists who are at the coalface of implementing these technologies into the clinics. And so what we really want to start from maintaining these technologies and introducing them is a sound ethical foundation on which we can make decisions. And I just note that our college, which is the main principal member of the Better Healthcare Technology Foundation, has recently adopted the ethical standards defined by the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Radiologists. And ethical decisions impact everyone associated with healthcare, all the way from us as either employees or patients or carers, through to decision makers in hospitals and society in general. So you just know that this presentation is being recorded under consent from the presenter and will be made at some point. If you have questions, please enter them into the questions or chat sections, and they'll be addressed in that way. Note that this presentation does contain live polls, so you can join those polls online, either on your workstation. There's the address there. The address has also been entered into the chat box if you wish to use that link. Or if you want to use your phone, there's a QR code there from which you can access the polls on your phone. So when you access that, you'll just need to enter your own information, your name, and then you should have access to the polls directly after that. And this QR code's on the next screen as well. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Megan Hyun from the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha. So Megan received her PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 2016, where she was researching small field dosimetry for radiotherapy. And in her current role, on top of providing education for students, residents, and patients, Megan undertakes research in adaptive radiotherapy and dosimetry, as well as medical physics education, physicist-patient interactions, and bioethics. And she serves on a number of committees for the AAPM, the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, related to ethics and education. And Megan's husband is an ethicist, and together they're publishing works on the ethics of physics and patient communication, and also in AI in radiation oncology and radiology. So I was very fortunate to participate in a workshop at the AAPM meeting this year in Washington, DC, in which Megan presented on the ethics of AI in medicine. And I was very keen to have that message spread throughout our region as well as we grapple with these new technologies. So Megan has generously donated her Sunday evening for this, which is the time currently in Omaha, where I see it's a very balmy 0 degrees Celsius, so perhaps it's a night for being inside anyway. But we're very grateful to Megan for providing her time to present to us today. So with that, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, for having me today, and of course for bearing with us on the technical difficulties that sometimes arise with these webinar presentations. So as Martin mentioned, I'm going to be discussing ethical considerations for the use of AI in medicine. And this talk is really broadly applicable to lots of areas of medicine, but we will talk about some specific examples in radiology and radiation oncology specifically. An alternative title for this talk could be A Physicist and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar, because it is a collaborative effort on the part of me and my husband, who's pictured here. We did actually walk into a bar, and over beer talked about ways that we could collaborate between our two fields, which are ethics and moral philosophy and medical physics within radiation oncology. So multiple papers have come out of that effort, and the slides that I'll show here are from one of those papers. Some brief disclosures to start with. As Martin mentioned, I'm a member of a couple AAPM committees related to ethics. However, I am not an ethicist, so take that with a grain of salt. But I am married to one, so I do publish in bioethics, and I feel that I am qualified to speak at this intersection between ethics and medical physics. I don't have any other potential conflicts of interest to disclose. And as he showed earlier, there will be some polls throughout this talk, so make sure that you have this site open in another browser, and each of these polls is going to be activated and deactivated throughout the talk for you to kind of share your opinions with the group. So here's an outline of the presentation for today. I'm going to start by talking about a widely accepted ethical framework and how we might apply this framework when making decisions in healthcare, especially when it comes to new technologies like artificial intelligence. I'll then go into some background literature on ethics and AI in medicine and talk briefly about some of the society statements that have come out on ethics and AI in radiology and radiation oncology in particular. We'll very briefly go over the applications of AI in these fields, and then we'll solve some ethical dilemmas that arise from how AI is developed and used in medicine, and then draw some conclusions at the end. So the next thing I'd like to do is ask the question, what words come to mind when you hear artificial intelligence? And it looks like you guys have already started on this, which is great. So I see words like technology and scripting, black box, cognitive, knowledge, software. Obviously, technology is a big one with this group. So there are some common themes with these words that we associate with AI. And this, this wasn't specific to medicine, but obviously all of these are going to be applicable when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence in medicine. And interesting ones that I see on here are abuse and bias. So it becomes clear right away that when we talk about the use of AI in a field like medicine, there are some dangers that we have in mind when we think about the use and inappropriate use of those tools when it comes to patient care and research. So thank you so much for participating in that little exercise. I think when members of the public hear artificial intelligence, they might have different words in mind than we do. They might think about the use of AI in lots of different science fiction media. So things like Terminator or iRobot, or more recently, episodes of the Black Mirror show on Netflix, which I'm definitely a fan of. So we know that AI in medicine is rapidly developing, but because we have all these kind of media associations with AI and the benefits and dangers that it might have, we know that we need to be cautious around its use, but we don't always know how to approach that use in a cautious way. And so this is where ethics can be helpful. So from these science fiction examples, they explore the beauty of AI and how it can be used to benefit humanity, but also the dangers that come with it, which I hope you'll see in the ethical dilemmas we're going to discuss, so how those dangers can be very real. And so we need a robust ethical framework that can show us how to use and develop AI for medical use that's going to maximize these potential benefits, but minimize the harms that might be done by using these tools for patient care. So knowing this, what can we as a society do? As medical physicists or radiation oncologists or biomedical engineers, what is our role in making sure that AI is rolled out in medicine in an ethical way? So to motivate this a little bit further, I also think that there's a lot of room in our field for education in the education space. A solid foundation in ethics is critical to, as your society is called, better healthcare technology. I think it's really essential that we bring our students up to understand ethics in a way that when they develop tools or use tools in the clinic, they're doing so in an ethical way. And training in bioethics supports patient-centered healthcare. I actually have a recent publication on this that I'd invite you to check out later that was just published, kind of recommending some basic tactics for teaching ethics in medical physics graduate programs in a way that promotes patient-centered care. So let's dig into this ethical framework that we see in the field of bioethics. So in Western medicine, there's 4 principles that have kind of been widely adopted for moral norms, you could call them. And these include respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. So each of these norms kind of covers different aspects of patient care. Autonomy is about respecting and supporting patients in having autonomous decisions about their medical care. Beneficence and non-maleficence are about balancing risk and harm, or risk of harm and benefit. And then justice, the last principle, is about fairly distributing those benefits and risks among our population. You might have seen these written slightly differently in documents like the Belmont Report about medical research, which couch them as respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And you can kind of see the similarities between the 2 groupings, where autonomy would be under respect for persons here, and then non-maleficence is kind of wrapped into the principle of beneficence. So we have this robust framework that gives us these moral norms that we, as a field, need to respect, but they don't always give us very concrete guidance in how to act when it comes to developing and using tools like AI. So let's dig into a couple of these in more detail. First, the principle of autonomy. So in this classic bioethics textbook by Beauchamp and Childress, an action is autonomous if it's done intentionally and without coercive or controlling influences. So an example of a controlling influence might be coercive pressure from a patient's family or their physician. Additionally, the act has to be done with substantial understanding in order to be autonomous. And this third part is going to be really important later when we talk about AI tools and how difficult they can be for patients and others to understand. The second and third principles of beneficence and non-maleficence kind of go together. And so we know that providers have a moral duty to act for their patients' benefit. And we know that physicians will tend to take a symbolic oath when they become doctors that includes an oath to do no harm. And so ultimately, every decision that we make for our patients is trying to balance these 2, minimize harms and maximize benefits. So it really is a balancing act where we might tally up all the benefits of a particular medical intervention and tally up all the risks and try to pick the decision that comes out with the best balance toward the benefit side. The last principle of these 4 is really the hardest to apply. It's very complex. Even if you read the chapter in Beauchamp and Childress about the principle of justice, you might come away scratching your head. And this is because there's multiple principles of justice that one might apply in the healthcare space. And unlike this general moral framework that I've presented here, we can't agree as a global society what principles of justice we ought to use. So, your society and the American society might have totally different ideas of what justice ought to look like. And so we might disagree greatly on how justice ought to be respected in patient care and research. One principle of justice I did want to bring up here that I think is fairly non-controversial is the fair opportunity rule. So this is just one example of a principle of justice that you might apply in your particular case. So according to the fair opportunity rule, no person should receive social benefits on the basis of undeserved advantageous properties. And likewise, no person should be denied social benefits on the basis of undeserved disadvantageous properties. So let's look at an example that kind of illustrates this. Imagine that you're in a society different than your current one, where every single person as they come of age has to take an aptitude or IQ test. And once they get the results of this test, that determines whether or not they receive free healthcare. So you might think that healthcare is a social benefit. And it seems very unfair to me, at least, that the social benefit of healthcare ought to depend on your score on an aptitude test or your IQ. And so this is an example of where the fair opportunity rule has something to say, that this society is very unjust because people are receiving a social benefit on the basis of undeserved disadvantageous properties. So this fair opportunity rule seems fairly intuitive. I think it's something that we can all agree ought to be respected. And so later in the talk, we'll apply this to ethics and AI. So now that we know these four principles and how they work generally, how do we actually apply them when it comes to ethical decision making? Well, generally, each of these principles in various scenarios is going to generate some kind of what we call a prima facie moral duty or a strong moral reason. So if I'm a physician and I'm trying to make a decision about an intervention for a patient, I might think about, well, what does the principle of respect for autonomy say that I ought to do? What kind of strong moral reason does it imply that I have to act in a certain way? But as you might imagine, with four principles such as these, you might have multiple duties that are implied from each principle, and one may outweigh another. So if we illustrate this, suppose that a doctor knows that if she reveals some information to the patient about their care that's pertinent to their decision making, that this patient might make an imprudent medical decision in her judgment. And so out of concern for the patient's well-being, this doctor refrains from sharing the information with the patient. And it may be that the principle of beneficence implies that she has a prima facie duty to behave in this way because it could benefit the patient to not make that imprudent decision. However, we'd also say that this physician has violated the principle of respect for autonomy because she has removed some pertinent information that she should be sharing with the patient that would lead to them making an autonomous decision that's not influenced by her manipulation. So I think a lot of us would have the intuition that this physician really ought to provide that information for the patient, even if it could result in the patient making an imprudent decision about their care. So in that case, the respect for autonomy would kind of win out over the principle of beneficence. So what we've just done is we've asked, what is this physician's all things considered moral duty? Not just a prima facie moral duty that was generated from one of these principles, but the ultimate duty that she has by considering all four. So what we would do is first identify any of the prima facie moral duties that are implied by these principles, and then consider which of those is the weightiest or highest priority, which one wins out in our particular case, and that helps us to make the most ethical decision according to this framework. So we might call this a pluralistic framework because it's coming from multiple principles that we're trying to respect. So now that we've laid out this framework, I'd like to do a brief literature review to talk about some of the existing literature on ethics in AI in medicine, and then radiology and radiation oncology in particular. So if you're interested in a little light reading, there's a couple really good papers that do meta-analyses or scoping reviews of lots and lots of bioethics literature on ethics in AI in medicine broadly. The first is a meta-analysis from Murphy and co-authors written in 2021, and they analyzed 103 papers that had been published before 2018. So you might notice right away that 2018 is already 4 years ago. And when it comes to AI, which is so rapidly developing, there might be some things that this meta-analysis misses, but it's still very useful despite being a few years out of date. So what they did was they looked at the literature and kind of identified what are all the uses of AI in medicine. And those fell into these three categories, according to them. The first was the idea of carer robots, or AI kind of being in charge of providing care for a patient. The second was diagnostics, and the third was precision medicine. And you can immediately see how some of these uses might come into play in radiology and radiation oncology, since we are in the diagnostic and precision medicine spaces. Additionally, they looked at ethical focus areas or places where you might expect to see issues or friction when it comes to principles of ethics. And those 4 areas were privacy, trust, accountability or responsibility, and bias. And a lot of these are going to come up later in the talk, especially the issue of bias. If you know anything about developing AI tools, you know that you typically have these data sets that you're using to train your model. And so your model is only going to be as good as the data that you feed into it for training. And so it's very easy to create tools that have bias in them because the data set was limited. This is going to come up again and again in this literature review. The second paper that I'd recommend is a scoping review from Morley and co-authors published in 2020. This was a review of 156 papers. And they basically separated ethical considerations into 6 categories, 3 of which have to do with evidence. So inconclusive evidence, inscrutable evidence, and misguided evidence are 3 separate categories that they identified. Unfair outcomes, which you can immediately recognize being related to the issue of bias. Transformative effects on the field of healthcare as a whole, and the pros and cons that go with that, and then concerns over traceability, because some of these algorithms can be difficult for the end user to understand where the decision that the AI made is actually coming from. And in both of these larger papers, you can start to kind of see how these different categories that they identify or dilemmas that they raise are related to the ethical principles in our framework. For example, the unfair outcomes is definitely related to the principle of justice, because you might imagine that tools that exhibit bias and violate the fair opportunity rule are definitely going to result in unfair outcomes if they're misused. There's also some literature out there on ethics in AI and radiology and radiation oncology in particular, but as you can imagine, there's way fewer papers on this than there are on medicine as a whole. But there are some concerns that are raised specifically with these fields. So for radiation oncology, one of the issues that's raised often is that we have a black box problem. Many of these AI tools are kind of inscrutable. It's difficult to trace back the decisions that they make or the recommendations that come out of them. And so for practitioners, it becomes kind of difficult to really understand the tools that they're using on a deeper level. And as a medical physicist, that definitely feels disturbing to me if that's the case. Additionally, there's a question around the importance of human practitioners. So you'll see later in this talk, we'll discuss where AI might replace humans and what kinds of ethical dilemmas arise as a result of that consideration. It's a little bit more in the future than really a current use of AI, but it's not difficult to imagine a future where that's happening. Of course, the idea of bias and mitigation of bias is coming up again. And again, we can kind of see that connection to our original ethical framework, particularly in the issue of bias, which relates to the principle of justice. And then later in the talk, we'll relate the importance of human practitioners to the concept of patient autonomy. Because if patients don't understand the tools that we're using, and there's no human kind of presenting this data to them, that does raise some concerns for us. There's 2 society statements that I want to draw your attention to as well, that I think are excellent reading when it comes to ethics in AI in radiology and radiation oncology. And the first one is this multi-society statement published in Radiology in 2019. So they emphasized 4 values, including well-being, minimizing harm, just distribution of benefits, and transparency. And you might guess what's going to come up next. We can connect these to our ethical framework as well. So even though lots of society, how we look at our ethical systems when it comes to AI, looking at this basic framework really is fairly robust. And it's something that we can come back to again and again when we think about how to apply these new technologies. So you could connect just distribution of benefits to the principle of justice, and well-being to the principle of autonomy, for example. Another one that is really one of my favorite statements on ethics in AI is the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Radiologists statement, which laid out several principles to guide both development and use of AI in radiology and radiation oncology. And I think that one of the important things about this is that they're focusing on multiple aspects of the AI's life cycle. So we're looking at both the development side and the clinical use. And as a medical physicist, people in my area are really at both of these stages of development. We are in the clinic implementing these tools, but we're also often the ones involved in developing them as well. So these principles include safety and privacy, avoidance of bias, which is a theme that you'll see come up again and again, transparency and explainability, application of human values, which you might think is helpful when we think about whether AIs can replace humans for certain tasks, decision making on diagnosis and treatment, teamwork, responsibility for decisions, and finally, governance. And something I'll point out here is that this talk is really not going to focus on this last one, the governance idea, because we're really trying to look at a first principles approach to ethics. It's obviously very important that when lawmakers are making policies on the use of AI, that they're rooted in ethical principles. But for the purposes of today's talk, we're really going to focus on the ethics side and not so much the law and regulatory side. A couple other papers that I think are really helpful when it comes to ethical decision-making with AI in medicine are this paper by Bulmer et al. From 2020, and then one other that I'll mention after this. And Bulmer and co-authors talked about the life cycle approach to developing AI tools. So what they said is that the AI tool is going through this life cycle from inception all the way to implementation. And at each stage of this life cycle, it's appropriate to ask different questions about how the tool is being developed and used to make sure that it's used ethically from start to finish. So some examples from their paper: at the inception phase, we might ask a question of, when we're researching this tool, what is the health question that this tool will help us answer that relates to patient benefit? So it becomes clear here that we're building the principle of beneficence in at the very beginning of this life cycle. And from the idea that we have about a tool we could develop, we're thinking about the patient's benefit ultimately. Likewise, when we enter the study phase, we might ask whether the data capture real-world heterogeneity, and this helps mitigate bias in the development of our tools. We might ask later, is the algorithm being compared to current best technologies? Is there transparency about flow of data and results? And then as we think about the tool's impact on society and on our patient care, does the model create or exacerbate inequities? So if back further in the life cycle, we asked about the data coming from real world heterogeneity, the answer to this question is going to be much easier. We would say, well, no, we don't expect it to exacerbate inequities because we've already built in earlier in the study those real world data for training our model. And then lastly, when we're implementing this tool, we want to continue to ask questions about how it's being used and assessed to make sure that it's continuing to be developed to represent our patient populations and to be used in an ethical way that respects those principles that we talked about. So we'll come back to this life cycle approach later because I do think it's really helpful when thinking about how to approach different dilemmas and who's responsible at different stages. The last paper I'll talk about is the 4 topics approach by 2 authors published in 2021. And they basically take our standard ethical framework that we've already presented, and they just reword these principles and reformat them in a way that they say is easier for radiation oncologists to understand. So the 4 principles that they lay out are patient preference, medical indication, quality of life, and contextual features. Patient preference is really coming from the principle of autonomy. Beneficence and non-maleficence are wrapped into medical indications. Quality of life pulls from all 3 of our initial principles, and then justice maps onto contextual features. And I'm not really going to bring this framework up again throughout the rest of this talk, because I think that we're intelligent enough to use the principles as originally written. I don't think we need them to be reworded for us. So I believe in us. I believe in that we can use this bioethics framework as it was originally written. So we've gone through some of the basic literature on ethics in AI and medicine. Now I'll just very briefly go over some applications of AI in radiology and radiation oncology that will sort of set the stage for some ethical dilemmas that we can then solve together. So first, when we think about radiology, we want to think about what are the strengths of artificial intelligence, and how do those strengths lead to its appropriate use in the radiology space. Well, we know that AI tools can be good at pattern recognition, and they can also represent and interpret complex data. And so what this leads to in radiology is being used for detection, diagnosis, workflow improvement, and of course, there's always going to be discussion on whether these tools could replace human practitioners such as radiologists. So if we wanted to take each of these applications in radiology and kind of group them together, we might group them as decision support, process support, and of course, replacement of humans. And so that's the radiology space, but is it a little bit different in radiation oncology? So these same strengths of AI tools can apply to radiation oncology similarly. Some examples include auto-segmentation, treatment planning, outcome prediction, quality assurance, and again, there's always interest in whether these tools might replace certain tasks that human practitioners traditionally do, including tasks done by radiation oncologists or physicists or even other stakeholders. And so we could again group these different benefits of AI in radiation oncology into three categories: decision support, process support, and then replacement of human practitioners. So you can kind of see similar uses of AI that crop up in both radiology and radiation oncology. And now that we've kind of given this very brief overview of those uses, let's dig into some ethical dilemmas. So we're going to focus on three different dilemmas, but these are obviously not the only three that exist. As you saw from our literature overview, there's lots of different problems that we could talk about when it comes to ethics in AI. But in our paper, we just engaged with a few to kind of give examples of how this ethical framework can be used to make decisions in this space. So the first dilemma that we'll talk about is the adoption of AI tools with potential biases. The second is global health considerations. We'll give an example specifically from radiation oncology for that one. And then third, how important are human practitioners? We've seen for both radiology and radiation oncology that there might be places where AI tools could replace humans for certain tasks, but how problematic might that be, and how can we respond to the changing landscape of healthcare if that were to happen? So the first one on AI tools and bias, as we've mentioned before, AI tools always depend on the data that you use to build the model. And oftentimes these data are limited. So let's look at a specific example that's from a group from Obermeyer and co-authors published in 2019. So there was a tool that has been widely used for by insurers to identify how healthy patients are, so that the insurers can then make decisions about what kinds of coverage they should get. And this tool that was developed would often erroneously identify Black patients as healthier than white patients who were just as sick using objective measures. So this seems really problematic, because what this might result in is the white patients and the Black patients getting different insurance coverage for the exact same conditions. And that seems to violate the fair opportunity rule. So if a physician or the insurer were trying to make decisions for patient care and patient coverage based on this tool, we might see inequities in the outcome. So when tools have this bias potentially built into them, this results in a trilemma for the hospitals or practitioners who are thinking about using them. They generally have three options. First, they can use the tools by offering them to patients of all demographic makeups. So they have a tool that they know was built with a limited data set. They could use it for all patients, regardless of whether they fit that data set or not. Alternatively, they could use the tools by offering them only to patients who are appropriate for the data set. So in the case of the example that we just gave, they would be limiting this tool for just Caucasian patients for whom it tends to be more accurate and the data is actually based on their demographic. The third option is to refrain from using those tools altogether, to see the tool and say, this tool has bias built into it. I'm not going to use it for any of my patients, regardless of whether they fit the data set or not. And I'll just point out that the way that we've kind of phrased this dilemma is looking at the responsibility of the hospital or the practitioner. And so in our life cycle that we talked about earlier, this is at the implementation phase. And this will come into play a little bit later. So each of these options in our trilemma is actually problematic for different reasons. Option A is problematic because the patients who aren't represented in the data set might be harmed. So in our example of the insurance tool, the Black patients could be harmed by not getting the same insurance coverage as their white counterparts with the exact same health conditions. And so this seems to be violating the principle of non-maleficence because we are doing harm by using that tool. Option B seems problematic because part of the population is receiving an undeserved privilege based on their advantageous properties. And so this seems to violate the principle of justice because it violates the fair opportunity rule that we talked about earlier. And option C is also problematic because some of the patients are deprived of a significant medical benefit. That these are the patients whose demographics fit the data set. And so it really seems like each of these options is problematic for a different reason. And this last one violates the principle of beneficence. So any option that we choose is going to violate one of our ethical principles. So we seem to be at kind of an impasse. So in order to think about how we might solve this trilemma and decide which is the most ethical choice, let's take another example. So in the field of genetics, there was a tool called Ambry Score. This is not an AI tool, but it is kind of analogous to AI tools that we might expect to see in our fields. And this tool was a screening tool offered by the company that was shown to be reliable for a subset of Caucasian patients due to limited data used to create the screening tool. So the company faced this exact trilemma. They could offer the tool to all patients, they could offer it for only a subset of patients, or they could take it off the market completely. And again, each of these is going to violate one of our ethical principles. And in the case of Ambry Genetics, they ended up taking this screening tool off the market altogether because they said, well, this screening tool is biased, it's unfair, and so we're not going to give it to anybody because we haven't yet been able to make it equitable for our whole patient population. So when thinking about whether Ambry Genetics made the right call or not, we could draw an analogy. So instead of thinking of a company, let's think about an individual physician. So we have a physician, Dr. Johnson, who uses Ambry Score or some analogous AI tool that you could imagine to assist in screening a Caucasian patient. So this is a patient who matches the data set, who she knows that this tool would be useful for. It seems wrong to withhold the information from the screening test from this patient. It would violate beneficence and non-maleficence as well as the principle of autonomy. And most of us would look at this physician's decision and say, yeah, she has this data available to her. She owes it to her patient to reveal that information and give him the potential benefit that that screening tool offers. But she also knows that she has other patients who can't benefit from this tool similarly. And so her situation seems morally similar to the company, Ambry Genetics' decision on whether to withhold the tool from society as a whole. And so if we take this argument to its logical conclusion, we would say, well, if Ambry Genetics, if the physician ought to offer this tool to her patient, then Ambry Genetics ought to allow that tool to be used by the patients that could benefit from it. On the other side of this argument, you might say that the physician and the company have similar prima facie moral duties, but the all things considered moral duties of a doctor might be different than those of a company. And there might be other moral considerations that we haven't considered here either. Something else that I'd like to point out is that the physician and the company often operate on different parts of this tool life cycle that we talked about earlier. And so at the inception and study and reproducibility phases, the company has been responsible for developing this tool and thinking about how it's going to be used down the line. And we might say that the principle of justice is weighted more heavily at these earlier development stages where the company has a responsibility to make sure they're developing a tool in a just way that can result in equitable use in the clinic. Whereas on the physician end, she's implementing or using a tool that's available to her, and perhaps the principle of beneficence and non-maleficence would win out on that stage of the tool's life cycle. And in her case, it makes sense to offer the tool to the patient, even though she knows that the company has really been acting unjustly on their end of the life cycle. And so given these two different arguments, you know, the physician and the company both ought to refrain from using the tool, or maybe one or both of them ought to offer the tool, let's see what you as the audience think. So I'm going to go ahead and activate our next poll and ask, what is the all things considered duty of the physician? All right, it should be active now. To reveal the test results to her patient, knowing that other patients can't benefit from them, or to refrain from revealing those results because she knows that the tool has some bias associated with it. And so far, it looks like everybody thinks that the physician ought to reveal the test results. And this isn't always the case. I have given this talk with other audiences, and this is a little bit more controversial. So it's always interesting to see where everyone lands on this question. All right, I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this one, and then we'll move on to the next question, which is, what is the all things considered duty of the company in this example? To offer the screening tool to the market, or to take the tool off the market because they know that it results in inequitable distribution. So this one's a little bit more controversial with you guys. I'm seeing some people think that the company should continue to offer the tool. Others think they should take it off the market. So it's not exactly 50-50. Some we're slightly biased toward offering the tool, but it's definitely a little bit more of a controversial decision. So it seems like with this audience, you do favor there being a difference between the responsibilities of the hospital practitioner, the physician, and the company who's responsible for developing the tool. And that's something I would definitely agree with. I do think that different responsibilities fall on each of these users' shoulders. So we're going to deactivate this poll and move on. The next dilemma that I'd like to talk about is the concept of global health. And the first problem that we might talk about is that global health is largely missing from the literature on ethics and AI in medicine broadly, as well as radiology and radiation oncology. And this seems to be a big problem to me, especially when we think about bias and principles of justice. So something that we could dig into in particular is that in the field of radiation oncology, we already know that there are issues of inequitable distribution, that the access to radiotherapy is limited in certain parts of the world, especially low and middle income countries. And so you might think, well, when we bring new tools like AI onto the market, the benefits of these tools will be unequally distributed by definition. If some places can't even get radiation therapy, they also won't be able to access new technologies like AI. And this seems to violate the principle of justice. However, the tools that are made available in wealthier nations, you might think the principle of beneficence would say that we ought to adopt them, even though we know that they aren't available everywhere. And so this seems to be a very similar dilemma or trilemma compared to the bias issues that we just talked about, just on a global scale. And here it's much more difficult to assign responsibility, because you could think about countries, you could think about hospitals, you could think about individual doctors, and you could think about developers. And so it becomes very difficult to say whose responsibility is what on this large scale. But something else I'd like to point out is that it's possible that AI could actually help close some gaps in treatment access in radiation oncology. So consider something like auto-segmentation, which could potentially improve contouring consistency between institutions. This type of tool would be particularly beneficial in low and middle income countries where resources are limited and staff might be undertrained. So in this case, AI tools could actually take years of accumulated experience from wealthier nations and make them available in low and middle income countries. So given that this might be true, the main challenge is how to mitigate bias in data sets so that we can allow tools like this to be generalizable wherever they might be deployed, whether it's in the country of their development or in a low and middle income country. And so we want to translate them in a way that increases access to life-saving treatment and is equitably distributed those benefits around the world. And so I'm not going to run a poll for this one, but I'd just like to sort of leave you with these questions on the issue of global health. What is the all things considered duty of hospitals and practitioners in wealthier nations where these tools are available? Should they be refraining from using them? I don't think that that's true, but what are the alternatives? What kinds of options do we have to invest in these tools and make them accessible worldwide? And even more importantly, what are the responsibilities of the developers of these tools who really have more ability to carefully think about their data sets and think about the accessibility of these tools and how they might increase access to care worldwide? The last dilemma that we'll talk about is the role of human practitioners. So we could easily imagine a future where AIs might produce reliable diagnoses or treatment recommendations that would traditionally be performed by humans. If we look at this kind of basic graph of the state of AI at different stages, we can see that early efforts of AI involved subhuman performance. The current state is that AIs generally can either match or even exceed human performance in certain tasks, but not all. But we could very easily imagine a future where AI performance exceeds human abilities in lots of different areas, including in medicine. And so when we think about AI tools becoming stronger and replacing humans, we also need to think about issues of autonomy. So these tools are obviously very complex. If they're replacing humans and then being used for patient care, and the patient doesn't understand how this tool is being used, this could limit patient autonomy, which would definitely be an issue. So we already went through this slide, so in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip through it. But the important thing here is that autonomy is completely linked to patient understanding. And so if the patient doesn't understand the tool that's being used to either supplement a decision about their care or to replace the human practitioner, this could reduce the autonomy that they have in their decision making. So the question is, are the technical facts about AI pertinent or relevant to patient decision-making? If they are, it doesn't necessarily mean the AI tool shouldn't be used. It just means that the hospital has a duty or responsibility to increase patient understanding. And my husband and I have written another paper that makes the argument that in order to do this, the best way is to offer physicist-patient consultations. And so even if we start using these really complex tools and and patient autonomy might be limited, if these facts are pertinent to their care, we are the perfect people to talk to the patient about this and improve their autonomy. Let's come back to the idea of us potentially being replaced by AIs and ask the question, are we replaceable? I would argue that we are not. So one of my main sources for thinking this is the book Compassionomics, which is a great read. I highly recommend it. The two authors devote more than 100 pages to the evidence that compassion improves patient outcomes. And they argue with a staggering amount of supporting data that incorporating compassion into medical care generates benefits for patients, motivates patient self-care, and improves healthcare quality. The principle of beneficence would suggest that hospitals have a duty to ensure their patients receive compassionate medical care. We also know that compassion is linked to empathy. And so being able to provide our patients with empathy, which is something we really at this point think that AIs are incapable of, is something that is, again, hugely beneficial to our patients and that we have a responsibility to offer them. And so if we think about the principle of autonomy that we just talked through, as well as these ideas of around empathy and compassion and moral reasoning that are unique to humans, it seems to me like hospitals have a responsibility to use AI where it's helpful and where it provides a benefit to their patients, but not to fully replace human practitioners in the tasks where humans are uniquely capable of doing patient care. And so what do you think is the all things considered duty of hospitals and practitioners when it comes to using AI tools, given that they are complex and potentially difficult for patients to understand? Should we still use them or refrain from using them? And it looks like you guys are all in agreement on this one, that AI tools, when applicable, ought to be used, despite the potential added complexity. And then similarly, what is the all things considered duty of hospitals when it comes to human practitioners? Should we be replacing humans with AI, or do you think that in the future, humans will continue to have a role, especially in radiology and radiation oncology? So this one's a little bit more controversial, but it looks like most people think that humans will continue to have a role. And this is something that I would definitely agree with. I think that even as AI can outperform us in certain areas, that there will always be a role for human moral reasoning, compassion, and empathy in patient care. So thank you so much for your attention as we went through this ethical framework and how we might apply it in radiology and radiation oncology when it comes to the use of AI. And so just a few conclusions as we wrap up. We've seen that ethics in AI is not just an idea for science fiction. It's something that we as physicists, oncologists, biomedical engineers, we can definitely contribute to. And there's new exciting opportunities for the use of AI in radiology, radiation oncology, and beyond. But there are also new dilemmas that arise. And so we really need this robust ethical framework so that we can make the best decisions as we develop and use these tools. And ethical principles, and I would argue collaborations with ethicists and the bioethics field can really help us to get there. And so if you are hungry for more, I'm just going to throw up a few options for you to take a further look at. My two papers with my husband, one is coming out next month on ethics in AI and radiation oncology. And then the second is already out, Respecting Patient Autonomy in Radiation Oncology and Beyond, which is about physics patient consultations. And I'd like to thank the other physicists in my group, as well as Alex Hyun, my husband and co-author, and the editors of our textbook where we published this paper. And my husband is shown here, as well as our third collaborator, our tiny human, who dressed as Harry Potter for Halloween this year. So I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have and keep the discussion going.
Thank you very much for that, Megan. That was a really fantastic overview of the field. There's a couple of questions in chat already, so I'm sure we can go on for a couple more minutes. If other people have questions, please enter them into the chat box. So the first one is about the limits of capability of AI algorithms, and how do we build those into the algorithms? And does AI know when it is exceeding its own limitations?
Yeah, that's a good question. Does AI know when it's exceeding its limitations? So I would say, based on my experience, I don't think this is a capability that AI currently has to know when it's exceeding its own limitations. And honestly, I think this is one of the best arguments for the continuing role of human practitioners, which is that we are needed to kind of oversee the development and the use of these tools, and asking when they exceed their limitations and what their capabilities and limits are, I think is the role of the human. So others who develop AI tools might disagree with me on that one, but I think that's a natural place for us to continue to have a role.
Mm-hmm. And there's a similar comment from Warwick Smith about the limits of AI and being designed in a way to stop when they reach a certain level of uncertainty. I think that's very good.
Yeah, and I do think that there are ways as a field that we need to think about how do we build these kinds of features into our tools where maybe they can give us warnings, you know, if they identify that they're being inappropriately used, or you know, what are the limitations of the tool. If those are kind of explicit to the end user, I think that would be a huge benefit. I think we've also heard a lot over the years about explainability of the tools. And so building tools with explainability, I think, responds to some of the dilemmas that have been raised in the literature about traceability and things like that.
Just while waiting for any other questions, I just have a question. In terms of having patient physicist interactions to help with the autonomy side, what if the physicist themselves doesn't understand these algorithms, and what mechanisms can we put in place to ensure that they do, so they can actually explain them to the patient?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think there's a couple things I would say on that. First is, as we just said, you know, the tools can be built with some level of explainability. The designer can kind of make them less of a black box to the end user, which would help the physicist to have that basic level of understanding. But I think there's also an opportunity for us as a field when it comes to education, and incorporating some basic AI training in our graduate students, our residencies, and postdocs and other learners, so that we can actually have enough of an understanding of AI and how it's used in medicine to actually explain it at a level the patient can understand. And I would say, you know, based on my own clinical experience, whenever we adopt a new tool, our whole physics team takes the time to try and understand it on as deep a level as we're able to. And so that's a responsibility that I think we as physicists would have in the clinic in order to be able to explain it to our patients. But I definitely wouldn't advocate sitting down with a patient and trying to explain something that the physicist doesn't understand. That's not something that I would want to encourage.
Sure.
I see someone named Jim has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we can actually provide them with the chance to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Jim, we can.
Good. Thank you very much, Megan. About 30 years ago, we had a visitor, radiation oncologist from Manchester in the UK, who informed us that lung cancer patients were treated by X-ray therapy on the basis of a chest X-ray. Now, if you assume that the chest X-ray was the AI of that era, we've come a long way since. So there's a lot of checks and balances now. AI for both radiology and radiation oncology can provide us with lots of useful information, but it's not the end of it. It's a tool which suggests, well, look at this on the radiology. What do you think, to the radiologist? And the AI tools for radiation oncology is of the type that we think that you should use this particular treatment plan, but ultimately it's a human decision that treats the patient. So in terms of safety, I think we can certainly use it, but it's just another tool that we'll have to learn to live with.
Absolutely. That's the way that I see AI as well. I think when we think about an interesting future where AI might replace humans for certain tasks, it's kind of an interesting question. It's a sci-fi feeling question. But in my mind, I think most people who are working with AI, developing these tools, wouldn't suggest that they actually replace humans altogether, that they're a decision and workflow support tool as they're currently being developed. And like you say, things might look totally different 30 years from now as well.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that today. You've really highlighted the fundamental link between AI and ethics and morality. And I think we really need that firm foundation to be able to evaluate these technologies and implement them. Really grateful for you giving up your Sunday evening for us. And I'm sure Harry Potter would be happy for you to help put him to bed now, but really grateful for your time. I'm not sure if Dale, if you can still speak to just close the meeting. You might have to assign him. Oh,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. Look, this is the final of our 4 topical lectures per year that the Better Healthcare Technology Foundation are putting on. I hope they've been useful to you. They are online. Please let your colleagues know about them if they weren't able to make them. I know these are not always easy times as we try and span from New Zealand through to Perth and Nebraska today. So we'll bring out a new program for next year. Looking forward to that. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.